Hello, my name is Chris from Discount Aquarium Fish and Reef in Tempe, Arizona. In this video, we're going to talk about plumbing for a tank with an overflow. We're going to break this down into its pieces, make it very easy for you so you can get it done right, find all the parts that you need. We're going to talk about the holes in the tank, whether they're under the overflows in the back or down on the bottom in front of the overflows. We're going to talk about your plumbing for your drains, which will take water down to your sump. We're going to talk about your plumbing for your returns, which will take water up into the tank. And finally, we're going to talk about your plumbing underneath that will take care of bringing that water to the proper places in the sump. First off, talking about holes in the tank. That's where bulkheads come into play. Generally, when you have a tank with an overflow system, you're going to have two holes down in the bottom of each overflow. Most likely, there's going to be a hole for a 1-inch bulkhead, which will be 1 3/4 inch big, and there's going to be a hole for a 3/4 inch bulkhead for the return, which is going to be 1.5 inches. You need to measure your holes and see what you've got down there. Some tanks do have a larger drain than 1 inch. Some tanks use Schedule 80 bulkheads, in which case the holes are going to be larger than those dimensions I gave you. So first off, you measure your holes. You go online, type in bulkhead hole sizes, find out the size bulkhead you're going to need. Sometimes it's a Schedule 80, which are generally gray. Most of the time it's going to be a Schedule 40, but there are different sizes. A Schedule 80 1-inch bulkhead, thicker plastic. It uses a hole that's 1 7/8 inch, around 2 inches. So a larger hole than the 1 3/4, which is used for the Schedule 40 1-inch bulkhead. Now, down in the bottom of your overflows, you may find that you have more than 2 holes. In that case, the holes that are larger, or the one hole that's larger, is generally going to be for your drain. The holes that are smaller, just like if there's only 2 holes that are 1 inch and 3/4, the smaller hole is for plumbing your return. The larger hole is for plumbing your drain. In some situations, you're going to find that there is only one large drain hole in the overflow. We'll talk about what you do then for your returns when we get to that point. Other times you're going to find that the overflow has 2 holes, but they're 1-inch holes, which means you're going to need to deal with putting a 1-inch bulkhead in for your 3/4 return and converting that, and we can take care of how to do that very easily as well. Sometimes for your returns, you're going to find that there's no holes in that overflow, but there are holes up in the back of the tank, or there may be no holes in that overflow and no holes up in the back of the tank for your returns. So we'll talk about how to deal with that as well when we talk about return plumbing. Other times you are going to have holes in this tank in addition to what's in the overflow in the bottom. These holes will be out more towards the center of the tank. They're generally used for plumbing a closed loop system, which we talk about how to do that for a filter or how to do that for water movement. It's completely separate from plumbing your overflow. So sometimes people will just plug those holes. They decide, I'm not doing a closed loop, I'm going to be using a sump system, I don't need the additional closed loop on my system. In that case, you're going to plug those holes, and when you plug those holes, let's say that they're 1-inch holes, this is a slip bulkhead. You have a couple choices. I would use a thread bulkhead like this one here, and you can thread a plug into the top of this bulkhead. That plug should have silicone put on it. Always use silicone for your threaded fittings rather than Teflon tape. Make sure it doesn't leak, and Teflon tape's a little tricky. If you use too much, you can crack a fitting. If you don't use enough, it can leak. So always better to use silicone for that. That would be if you're just wanting to plug all those holes up on the bottom. Now, if you think for those closed loop holes, you're going to eventually want to add some kind of filter system, you're gonna want to add flow and no filter system. In that case, you're gonna want to do this plugging a little bit differently so that you leave yourself those options. In that case, you're going to use a bulkhead that is slip on the top and thread on the bottom. With that kind of bulkhead, you can slip a plug in the top and not glue it, so that later you can scoop the sand away and you can pull that plug out, because you're going to be plugged on the bottom up here. In order to do the bottom, we're going to want to have a valve on it so that we can shut off the water, and we can use that valve for any kind of plumbing that we want to do later. In order to do this, you're going to have a thread, so this would be a slip thread bulkhead. You're going to thread in a riser in the bottom of that. You're going to have your valve, and then you'll thread in with, of course, silicone. You'll thread in a barb fitting on the bottom so that you can hook up 3/4 inch tubing, do your closed loop filter or closed loop water movement. So that's if you want to be able to do something in the future. You'll put valves on the bottom of each of those, to slip in plug on the top so you can easily remove that. So that covers plugging up those extra holes that we're not going to be using. And again, we have another video that talks about how to plumb that for a closed loop system. But if you've got your valves already in place, then you're ready for that. If you've glued in some kind of plug and have no valves, well, then you're plugged. You can't use that closed loop system without draining the tank and redoing things. Now we're back to those overflows and talking about plumbing them. First, we're going to talk about the returns. Now, if you have a hole in the bottom of that overflow for a return, and like I say, you may have a 1-inch drain and a 1-inch return, the return's going to look like this. You're going to have a 3/4 inch barb fitting threaded into a threaded bottom bulkhead. You're going to use silicone to thread that in. You're going to have a 3/4 inch bulkhead. You're going to glue in a 3/4 inch piece of tubing. This will stick through the bottom there. Remember, with your bulkheads, they have a gasket in the middle. The nut screws off of them. You will put them down in with the nut off and then come up from the bottom of the tank, tighten that down. Again, gaskets on the inside, no need for silicone or anything on this. It's a rubber gasket, makes a complete seal. You'll be coming up to the top, and if you have an overflow that doesn't have holes in the top of it for the return, you're either going to come directly over the top with something like this, which is a threaded elbow, threaded lock line, slip here. Lock lines are made with 3 components. They have the NPT adapter, which threads in. They have whatever length of lock on it. They have a tip on the end. Some people will have a Y here if they want to split that on the outside. 2 tips, so there's a few different configurations there. Some people will be using a flare tip like this, or they'll be using a nozzle tip like this. Flare tip's a little more expensive. Lock lines are proprietary, so you're usually looking at $2, $6, $5, $2 if it's the non-flare tip to get your lock line in there. And you may need multiple lock lines if you have more than one return coming up. You can also, if there's fins on the top of that overflow, but there isn't a hole for this, you can use a jigsaw or you can use a hole saw, and you can cut a pie-shaped opening in the top of that overflow or knock out a couple teeth. They can fit right here where there's still some thread right there, so that this sits a little further down, which will be a little more aesthetically pleasing. Also, with regard to your returns, might as well mention this. No matter where we put them, whether they're coming in from the back of the tank, whether they're coming in from the overflow, you're always going to want to have them up high, near the top. And your tip on those, you're not going to want to have that poking way down into the water, because the pumps go off, it gets siphoned down, and you'll have a fair amount of water that has to get down to that tip. Alternatively, if you just don't want them that high, you can drill a small hole in the lock line near on the MPT adapter. That will cause a siphon break, and this can be down a little further without siphoning the water back down into your sump. Now, sometimes you're going to have an overflow, and up near the top, whether it's got 1 or 2 holes in the bottom of the overflow for the return, it's going to have 1 or 2 holes in the top where you also can install a 3/4 inch bulkhead in those. And if you do that, you're going to have that bulkhead sticking out of that hole and your lock line. And then you're going to have, if it's a single, you'll have a fitting like this, and then you can go ahead and use soft plumbing from a barb fitting coming down, or you can plumb it with something like this where you come up to an elbow, but then you're going to need a riser to be able to screw that into the bulkhead, or if it's a slip, you'll put a small piece of 3/4 PVC so you can slip that into the bulkhead. So depending on your application, that's how that's going to be done. And also, when we talked about no holes being there, if you want to drill holes up near the top so that you can use a bulkhead coming out rather than the notching method and coming over the top like we discussed, that certainly is possible too. You're going to have to buy 1 or 2 extra bulkheads to be able to do that. No problem there. Now sometimes you're going to have 2 return holes down in the bottom of that overflow, and you're going to say, hey, I've got 2 holes there, but I only want to have, one return. Wouldn't recommend that, but in that case, you would soft plumb it on up. You would come to a T so that you can use those 2 spouts up near the top. Put this onto the bulkhead, go up to your T, you'd use a small piece of PVC to hook to those 2 bulkheads that are the returns. Wouldn't really recommend that because you don't really need to split that at the top if you only have the 1 hole there. You can always use a split lock line. That way you don't restrict flow, breaking a single down into double and losing some of the flow up there. Other times you're going to have 1 hole down in the bottom, and you've got 2 up top that you decide you want to split it there and bring it out. In that case, you are going to soft plumb it. You're going to have a bulkhead down in the bottom of the overflow. You're going to have a barb fitting on the underside for hooking up your underneath plumbing. You're going to have a barb fitting on the top side. You're going to come up near the top. You're going to come to your T, and you're going to go to your 2 outlets. So a few different options there. Other times you're going to find that you have no hole for the return in your in your overflow, but you have holes on the back of the tank up high where you can put your returns. In that case, you're going to just use something like this. This will thread through that hole. You'll tighten up your bulkhead with the nut on the the nut on the outside and the gasket on the water side. This would be your return inside the tank. You'll have a 90-degree fitting for your tube on the outside, and you can have it straight, doesn't really matter. Then you'll have 2 of those coming from it. So down here you're going to have a T, so you can soft plumb this into the T, soft plumb the other one into the T, soft plumb straight down to your return pump, which sits in the sump, and bingo, you got your returns up top towards both sides of the tank. If you have no holes in the back, and you have no return hole, just a drain hole in the overflow, you've got a few options. You can use 1 or 2 returns like this. If you use these, they're going to need to hang over the back of the tank. If it's acrylic, you're going to need to notch out with a jigsaw a little bit of the Euro brace so that you can put this in place. When you do put this in, I recommend cutting a little block of wood to hold this up a little higher so it's not sticking way down into the water and we have too much siphon coming back that way. That's one way. The other way is to say, no, I'm going to take a glass bit. We have videos on drilling holes, and I'm going to drill those 2 holes so that I can install bulkheads there and have this system that we just talked about for returning that water to the tank. Next, the drains. The overflow box is basically a cover for drain plumbing. The drain plumbing takes care of everything. If you had a possible steam leak in the overflow box with proper drain plumbing, that's not a problem at all. It's not going to hurt the way it functions. Still, most of the water is going to come over the fins on that overflow, which is really the purpose of the overflow, so that you take water from the top, skimming the top of the water down into the sump. Inside that overflow, we're going to have something called a Durso standpipe. This is a factory designed Durso standpipe. These are generally seen in all glass aquariums and marine land tanks that are factory drilled with factory overflow. These are kind of nice. They are adjustable for height, so depending on how high your overflow box is, how tall the tank is, you can adjust them there. I usually put the top of this here kind of even with the top of the overflow. This part sticking out obviously slightly above the overflow. Water comes in, goes down. This keeps everything quiet. Now, there's one thing with Durso standpipes. You'll notice that we have a fatter tube here. This happens to be 1.5 inch. Then it's going to like a 1.25 inch, and it has an adapter so that it can go into a standard 1-inch bulkhead. When you build these for yourself, you never want to use 1-inch PVC and just come straight up and put your plumbing on the top. It's noisy and it's not big enough. Even though it goes to 1 inch down here when it goes into the bulkhead, I'm not a fluid engineer, but for some reason you have to build these with an adapter. This is just simple PVC adapter going into a coupler. This pokes down into my 1-inch bulkhead. I've got my 1.25 inch PVC. I go ahead and make something like that by using a T. I put an elbow on here. If you want, you can put a strainer, not really needed. This is a fat pipe. Very rare that something's going to get over the overflow box that's big enough to cause a plug there. But if you worry about that, you can get yourself a strainer like that, put it on the end here. You don't really need to have this up top, but this particular one was built with a plug that then has little holes drilled in it. If you want to get fancy, you can do that as well. That's how we build a Durso standpipe to go inside the overflow. That's why when we plumb our drains inside the overflow, we're usually going to use a 1-inch bulkhead that slip on the top, so this can slip down in and also slip on the bottom so that we can easily plumb it underneath, which we'll be talking about next. One last thing with regard to your standpipe for your drains in the tank. Sometimes you're going to have an overflow box that's just too small and you can't fit this configuration in there with the return coming up. There's just not enough space. In that case, you're going to use what's called a Maggie muffler up near the top. I still recommend doing a conversion from your 1-inch going to a fatter pipe coming up. You can use the larger Maggie muffler, which these larger ones come with a little slip-in adapter. That's 1.5 inch, and that's 1.25 inch. Depending on what size that bulkhead drain hole is, you may have that size pipe 1.25 or 1.5 inch coming up or going into that hole. If not, you're going to need to convert it to whatever size you want coming up to this. You'll either go with 1.25 or you'll go with 1.5. It's 1.5. You'll pull out that little deal there and you use your Maggie muffler and you're good. These are a little bit expensive. They're proprietary, generally about 15 to 20 bucks for the big one. I only use the small one if I've got a smaller tank where it's okay to be using a 1-inch drain pipe. These are made for 1 inch. That's what you use when you're plumbing a 1-inch. Which reminds me, your drain's coming down. For every inch of drain you have, you can pull down about 800 gallons of hour of water. So if you only have one overflow in that tank, and it's a 1-inch bulkhead, you're going to select a pump which is going to have about 800 gallons per hour near the top. The reason I say near the top is all pumps have head loss for every foot you're coming up. If it's a new pump, you can generally get that on the package, or you can look it up, or for a used pump you can look it up. You want to know that it might be a 1,200 gallon per hour pump at the bottom, and it might be 800 at the top. You want to know you've got your 800. If you have a bulkhead hole down at the bottom that's 1.5 inches, you're going to be able to do 1,200 gallons per hour going down. If you have two 1-inch drains, you're going to be able to have 1,600 gallons per hour going down. You may have two overflow boxes in this tank, in which case you're just going to replicate your plumbing for those two overflow boxes, and you're all set. As far as underneath the tank, it's going to be fairly easy. We already talked about our returns. If you have a bulkhead coming out the bottom with a barred fitting, or you have a bulkhead coming out the back with a barred fitting, if there's two of them, you're going to plumb them together to a T. You're going to use soft plumbing. You're going to plumb into your pump, and you're going to be all set on your return fittings. So that's a piece of cake as far as plumbing that. You want to use soft. It's easy to move your pump around. Really no reason to hard plumb that. So that's how that will be plumbed underneath. With regard to your drains underneath, you got a couple options. Generally, you're going to hard plumb this. You're going to need elbows, and you're going to need 1-inch PVC. The slip bulkhead, which is why we're going to use a slip for our drains, is so that we can slip this in there and glue it, and we can have our elbows so that we're going over to wherever we need to go into the sump. Some sumps are going to have a 1-inch fitting coming out of them. We can hard plumb directly into that. If they don't, and you're just plumbing over to the area your protein skimmer will sit, the first chamber of the sump, and you have an elbow going down, so maybe we came over and then we had to go down, you're going to want that water to come out under the water level, so you'll just have a down pipe going into that sump. So simple there. When we have a sump that has fittings on the top, has bulkheads on the top, for 1-inch tubing to slip into those bulkheads, I like to use one of these flexible tubes for a couple reasons. These are nifty little things. You can get them in 6 foot, 4 foot, 3 foot. They slip 1-inch PVC directly into them. These don't leak where this is slipped in. I'd still glue it at the bulkhead, but when you have a sump or a wet dry that has slip in on that side, you also slip in a little piece of PVC. You slip the other side of your tube in there, and especially for wet dries or things where you kind of need to be able to remove or have some wiggle space for where that goes into the sump, having that soft tubing is much better than trying to plumb hard tubing into that. So this is another way on the bottom to come down and go into that sump. That pretty much completes your plumbing for a overflow system. Again, we're going to use silicone for any of our threaded fittings. Bulkheads always go with the gasket on the water side. I go hand tight on bulkheads and then a quarter turn with a channel lock. Not really necessary to worry too much about having a couple drips, because you can always put a little bit more tightness on that later, but you need to be careful. You don't want to crank it too much, because you can break that nut that goes on the bottom of the bulkhead. For any of our PVC areas where we're connecting a tube into a fitting, we're just going to use PVC glue. Christie's Red Hot is fine. This happens to be a clear medium PVC cement. It's a single step, which most of them are. Most people don't use primer anymore to prime the pipe and then use glue. So any of those fittings, you won't have salt creep or drip if you glue your slip-in fittings. Underneath with bulkheads, I like to leave enough tubing so that if I have to cut that later to move a tank, I can leave enough space to be able to couple it back together. You always want to be thinking one step ahead as far as your plumbing. Hope you've enjoyed the video today. If you ever have any questions or want us to do a video on something, look us up online. Discount Aquarium Fish and Reef. You'll find our Instagram, you'll find our Facebook, you'll find our website, you'll find our email. You can contact us through any of those means, and we'll be sure to answer your questions or help you with anything you need. I'm Kline. This has been my time.